For 6 years, I played the same unfinished song at the end of every set, and every night I stopped at the exact same note because that was the note my wife died on. Then, one Tuesday, a white girl with a violin case and no money walked into my empty club and played the next note out loud, and I nearly dropped to my knees. Before I tell you what happened after that and how a stranger finished the song that finished me, do one thing for me. If you believe that grief can be turned back into music by the right person walking through the right door at the right hour, then hit subscribe right now, because this story is going to take you all the way down before it lifts you back up. Stay with me. It earns it. My name is Theo Marsh. I'm 39 years old. I'm tall, and my mother would want me to tell you still handsome despite everything, and I have played the piano since before I could reach the pedals. I grew up in a house where the piano was the most important piece of furniture, more important than the couch, more important than the television, more important. My father used to joke than him. My grandfather bought it secondhand off a church that was closing and moved it 3 times across 3 cities, and it survived all of it out of tune and honest, and I learned to play on those same worn keys. Music was never a hobby in my family. It was how we talked to God and to each other and to the dead. When somebody in my family passed, we didn't say much. We sat down at the piano and we played until we could breathe again. I made my living at it, which is not an easy thing to do, and I made it at a small jazz club downtown called the Blue Egret. It wasn't mine at first. I was just the house pianist, 6 nights a week, back corner, dim light. But over the years, the old owner came to lean on me more and more, and when he got sick, he sold me the club for almost nothing on a handshake and a payment plan, because he said the Blue Egret should belong to somebody who understood that a jazz club is not a business. It's a church that happens to serve whiskey. So it became mine. A narrow room with brick walls, 40 tables a stage, barely big enough for a trio and a piano, my grandfather would have recognized as family. I ran it with my wife. Her name was Nadia, and she sang. God, she sang. I have accompanied a lot of singers in my life, technically better singers, more famous singers, but I have never in my life sat behind anyone who could do what Nadia did, which was make a room full of strangers. Feel like she was telling each one of them a secret. We were the Blue Egret, the 2 of us, piano and voice. She'd stand in the curve of the piano with one hand resting on the wood, and I'd play, and we'd have entire conversations in front of 100 people that nobody else could hear but us. We had a son, Elijah. He was born in a snowstorm 3 weeks early in a hospital where the power flickered twice while Nadia was pushing, and he came out of her already impatient, already loud, and we loved him past all sense. Nadia used to nurse him backstage between sets, and he grew up falling asleep in a padded drawer in the office to the sound of his mother's voice coming through the wall. I used to think on those nights that no child in the history of the world had ever been sung to sleep by a better lullaby than my son had every single night for free. Nadia died when Elijah was 3. I'm going to tell you how because you should know, and because I've spent 6 years not being able to say it out loud. We were on stage, full house a Friday, the best crowd we'd had in months. We were in the middle of a song I had written for her, an original, the only song I ever wrote that I thought was truly good, and I still hadn't finished it. I'd been writing it slowly for 2 years, and I kept getting stuck near the end, and Nadia used to tease me that I'd finish it the day I finally understood what I was trying to say. And that Friday night mid-phrase in front of 100 people in the middle of the song I wrote for her, she stopped singing. Just stopped. And she reached out and put her hand flat on the piano, the way she always did, except this time she was holding herself up. And then she went down. It was an aneurysm, something that had been waiting silently in her head her whole life, the doctor said. A thread that could have held for 80 years, or given way at any second, and it gave way in the middle of our song. She was gone before she reached the floor. She died in the curve of the piano, with her hand on the wood on a single note, and I have that note burned into me the way you have a scar. I know exactly where in the song she stopped. I could show you on the keys. It's a suspended chord, a chord that leans forward, a chord that's asking a question and waiting for an answer that never comes. That is the note my wife died on, and I never finished the song. I never could. But here's the thing I did, the thing that I think tells you everything about the shape of the last 6 years. Every single night at the end of every set, after all the standards and all the crowd pleasers, I played that unfinished song. Every night, and every night I played it right up to that suspended chord, that leaning, questioning note, the note where Nadia's voice stopped, and then I took my hands off the keys, and I sat there in the silence, and then I stood up and I said, "Good night." 6 years. 2,000 nights. I stopped at the same note every time because playing past it felt like agreeing that she was gone and taking my hands off the keys. Felt like keeping her for one more second in that suspended place where the answer hadn't come yet, and so anything was still possible. The club was dying. I should tell you that too because it matters. A jazz club run by a grieving man who won't change the set list and won't smile at the customers and won't finish his own famous song is not a club that thrives. The regulars drifted off. The bookings dried up. I was 3 months behind on the lease, and the man I'd bought it from was dead now, and his son who held the note was not sentimental about churches that serve whiskey. Elijah was 9 and getting old enough to notice that his father owned a room full of empty tables. He'd do his homework at the bar after school, and I'd catch him counting the crowd some nights, and the number was going the wrong way, and he was too smart and too kind to say anything about it, which was worse. There was a regular named Saul, an old man who had been coming to the Blue Egret since before it was mine, since before I was born, probably. He sat at the same two-top by the window every Thursday for 30 years, 1 bourbon, no ice, and he'd tap 2 fingers on the table on the 2 and the 4, like every real listener does. Nadia used to sing directly to Saul on the slow numbers because he cried so easily and so honestly that it made the whole room feel safe to feel something. And one Thursday that autumn, Saul didn't come, and he didn't come the Thursday after that either. I called his daughter, and she told me gently that Saul wasn't getting out much anymore, that his knees and his heart had finally caught up with him, but that wasn't the whole truth, and I knew it. The whole truth was that Saul had stopped coming because the room wasn't warm anymore, because a jazz club run by a man who won't finish his own song stops being a church and starts being just a room where a sad man plays piano at some tables. Saul had come for 30 years to feel something, and I'd stopped giving him anything to feel. That one empty two-top by the window did more to tell me the truth about myself than the ledger ever did. Elijah started keeping the count in his head. I didn't ask him to. I just noticed one night closing out the register that he'd written a number on the back of his math homework, 22. And I realized he'd been counting the house every night for weeks, the way other kids count baseball cards, tracking his father's slow disappearance one head at a time. He never showed me the numbers. He just kept them, my 9-year-old carrying the arithmetic of our decline around in his backpack so I wouldn't have to see it on his face. Which brings me to the Tuesday, a cold, dead Tuesday in November, the deadest night of the deadest month, maybe. 8 people in the room. I finished the set the way I always did. Standards, then the unfinished song up to the leaning note, hands off the keys, silence, good night. The 8 people clapped politely and started gathering their coats. And a young woman I'd never seen before, who'd been sitting alone at a back table nursing 1 cheap glass of wine for 2 hours with a violin case leaned against her chair, stood up. She walked to the edge of the little stage. She was pale, with dark hair coming loose from a knot, wearing a coat that had been good once and wasn't anymore, and she had the specific hungry thinness of a person who is choosing between rent and food and choosing rent. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, and she said, "You didn't finish it." "I never finish it," I said. I wasn't unkind about it. I was just tired. "It's not a finished song." "No," she said. "You're wrong. It wants to resolve. That whole song has been walking toward one note for 4 minutes, and you keep stopping 1 step short of it." And before I could tell her she didn't understand that she couldn't possibly understand. She opened her case, and she took out a violin that was even more worn than my piano, and she lifted it to her chin, and she played the note. The next note. The one after the leaning questioning chord. The answer. And it was right. That's the thing. It was so right that the whole room went still, all 8 people frozen with their coats half on, because this stranger had reached into a song she'd heard exactly once and pulled out the exact note it had been reaching for, the note I had spent 6 years refusing to play, because playing it meant the question was over and the answer was yes, she's gone. The violin held that note in the air, warm and sure and final, and somehow not sad at all. And I sat at my grandfather's piano with my hands in my lap, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had been sealed shut for 6 years, and I could not tell if it was grief or relief. And I understood sitting there that they had been the same thing the whole time. When the note faded, she lowered the violin, suddenly embarrassed, like she'd just realized what she'd done, playing another man's private grief back to him in an empty club. "I'm sorry," she said. I shouldn't have. I don't even know why I... What's your name? I said. My voice came out strange. Grace, she said. Grace Bellamy. I'm sorry, I'll go. Grace. I stood up from the piano, which I had not done in the middle of a room in a very long time. Where did you learn to hear like that? Grace Bellamy, it turned out, had heard like that her entire life, and it had cost her everything. She'd been a prodigy, the real kind. Conservatory at 16, a soloist's career laid out in front of her like a red carpet. And then at 24, 3 years before that, Tuesday, she'd developed a tremor in her left hand, a neurological thing, mild, intermittent, invisible to anyone who wasn't holding a bow, but in the world of solo violin. A mild, intermittent tremor is a death sentence because that world does not forgive one wrong note in 1,000. Her career ended the way careers like that end, not in one dramatic night, but in a slow, quiet series of not quite good enough auditions until the calls stopped coming. She'd sold most of her good instruments. She taught a few students. She played weddings when she could get them. And she had walked into the Blue Egret that Tuesday because it was warm and cheap and she had nowhere else to be, and she had heard a man play a song that stopped one note short of home, and she had recognized it because she was living one note short of home herself. She told me the whole story slowly over weeks. Not all at once, the way you tell someone a thing that still cuts you to say. The tremor had shown up for the first time in the worst possible place on stage during a competition in Brussels she had been favored to win. A concerto she'd played 100 times, a passage she could have played asleep, and in the middle of it her left hand had betrayed her, one finger landing a hair flat, then another, tiny things no ordinary listener would have caught. But the jury caught it, and she caught it. And she said the worst part wasn't losing that competition. It was the specific moment afterward in the practice room alone when she'd tried to play the passage again, slowly, carefully, willing her hand to obey, and it wouldn't, and she'd understood in that fluorescent little room that the thing she was, the only thing she'd ever been, the thing every adult in her life had told her she was born to be, was quietly ending, and there was no one to blame, and nothing to fight, and nowhere to appeal. You can survive losing a thing, she told me. What almost killed me was losing the thing I thought I was. When they stopped calling, I didn't know who was left. She'd spent 3 years finding out who was left, and who was left, it turned out, was a woman who could still hear better than almost anyone alive, and who had walked into my club on a dead Tuesday and heard in a stranger's unfinished song the exact sound of her own unlived life. I can't play the hard things anymore, she told me that night after the 8 people left and I poured us both a real drink. The fast things, the flashy things, the things that made me somebody. My hand won't do it, but the slow things. She turned her glass in her fingers. The slow things I can still do. Turns out you don't need a perfect hand for the slow things. You need something else. And nobody in my old life wanted the slow things. They wanted the fireworks. I don't want the fireworks, I said. I run a jazz club that's about to close. All I've got is slow things. She laughed the first time and it changed her whole face. Then maybe, she said, we're both exactly broken enough to be useful to each other. The first time we rehearsed it was terrible, and I want to tell you that, because everybody skips this part, and it's a lie to skip it. Piano and violin do not automatically sound like anything. We spent a whole afternoon crashing into each other, me playing too full, the way you play under a singer, or hearing the empty space where a voice used to be and not knowing whether to fill it or leave it. Twice she stopped and put the violin down and said maybe this was a mistake. But then late, when we were both tired enough to stop trying to be good, she started playing a counter melody so quiet it was almost not there, threading underneath what I was doing instead of on top of it, and I pulled my left hand back to make room, and for about 8 bars, the two of us found a thing that neither piano and voice nor anything else had ever sounded like. 8 bars. We both heard it. She looked up at me over the violin, and I looked back, and neither of us said anything, because you don't talk about a thing like that. You just try to find your way back to it. It took us weeks to find it reliably. But that first 8 bars was the whole promise of everything that came after, and I have never forgotten the specific hour of the specific afternoon, when a broke pianist and a fallen violinist accidentally became something. I hired her the next week. I couldn't really afford to, but I did it anyway because the truth was I could not afford not to. She started playing with me on the slow nights, and then on the other nights too, piano and violin, and it was not piano and voice. It was never going to be piano and voice, but it was something, it was its own thing, and it was alive. Words started to move the way it does. People came to hear the jazz pianist and the fallen violinist play the sad, slow, honest things that nobody else in the city was willing to play. The empty tables started filling in from the back. Not fast. But the numbers started going the right way again, and Elijah noticed that too and started counting the crowd with a different look on his face. Saul came back. That's how I knew it was real. 3 weeks after Grace started playing on a Thursday, the door opened and there was Saul moving slow on a cane, now his daughter holding his elbow, and he made his way to the same two-top by the window and ordered 1 bourbon, no ice. And that night Grace and I played the slow things, the honest things, and I watched Saul's 2 fingers find the 2 and the 4 on the tabletop the way they had for 30 years, and I watched the old man cry, the easy, honest tears he'd always cried, and when we finished he lifted his glass to me across the room, and I understood that the church had reopened, that the warmth had come back into the room, not because I'd fixed myself, because someone had walked in and started the fire again while I was still too frozen to strike a match. The nights built on each other. Grace had a way of talking to a crowd between songs that I never had, unpolished and a little shy, and completely disarming, telling the true small stories behind the tunes, and people leaned in. She'd bring Elijah up near the end sometimes on the easy nights, and let him play 1 simple line on the violin with us, and the room would go warm and quiet for the boy, the way rooms do, and my son would stand in the curve of the piano exactly where his mother used to stand, 1 hand resting on the wood, and I would have to look down at the keys so the crowd wouldn't see my face. Grace saw it every time. Afterward, she'd bump my shoulder with hers and say nothing, which was the kindest thing she could have done. There was 1 bad night in the middle of it, and I'll tell you about it, because the good nights don't teach you anything. A booker from a bigger club across town came in, heard us, and offered Grace a standing gig 3 nights a week. Real money, a real stage, everything the blue egret couldn't give her. He said it in front of me on purpose, the way that kind of man does testing to see whether she was tied to the sinking ship or just passing through it. And Grace looked at him and looked at me and looked at Elijah doing his homework at the bar, and she said, "I'm already home, thanks." 5 words. But I noticed she didn't look at me when she said it, and I noticed I didn't say anything back. And I think both of us filed that silence away, the first small proof that there was something real between us that neither of us was brave enough to name yet. And Elijah loved her. That was the part I didn't expect and couldn't have stopped if I'd tried. My son, who had grown up on his mother's voice and lost it at 3 and grown into a quiet, watchful, careful boy, latched onto Grace Bellamy with his whole heart. She taught him violin, started him on it, and he was not a prodigy. He was a completely ordinary 9-year-old with an ordinary ear. And Grace did not care even slightly, and that was exactly why he loved her. She never once made him feel like music was a test he could fail. She made him feel like music was a place he was allowed to live. You don't have to be good at it, I heard her tell him one afternoon, the 2 of them sawing away at Twinkle Twinkle behind the bar. You just have to mean it, meaning it is the whole secret. Everything else is just practice. I fell in love with her slowly, and then all at once, the way you fall asleep. And I fought it hard for a long time, because falling in love felt like a betrayal, felt like taking my hands off the keys and agreeing that Nadia was gone. But Grace never asked me to stop grieving. That was the thing about her. She'd lost her own whole life, her own identity, the future she'd been promised, and she understood grief from the inside, and she never once tried to talk me out of mine. She just stood next to it. She grieved her hands, and I grieved my wife, and somehow standing next to each other in that grief, night after night, we stopped being quite so alone in it. But I have to tell you about the night it almost broke, because a happy ending you didn't have to earn is worth nothing. It was February, and 2 things came due at once. The lease first. The owner's son gave me a final number and a final date, a Saturday 30 days out, and it was more money than the blue egret had cleared in 6 months. I was going to lose the club. My grandfather's piano, the stage where Nadia sang, the drawer where Elijah slept, all of it gone. And the second thing was Grace. She got a call out of the blue from a chamber orchestra, 2 states away, a real orchestra with a real salary and health insurance, a second section seat, unglamorous, safe, exactly the kind of slow, steady work her hand could still do. They wanted her. It was everything a sensible person in her position should have wanted: security after years of scraping a future. And she came to me on a Wednesday afternoon with the offer in her hand and her face torn in half, and she said, "Theo, I have to tell you something, and I need you to not make it harder than it already is." I made it harder than it already was. I'm not proud of it. I told her she should take it. I told her the club was closing anyway, that I couldn't ask her to go down with a sinking ship, that she deserved security and a future, and I had neither to offer her. All of it true. All of it a coward's way of not saying the actual true thing, which was, don't go, I love you, stay. I hid behind being noble because being noble was safer than being honest. And Grace, who had spent her whole life hearing what was actually being said underneath the notes, heard exactly what I was doing. You know what your problem is, she said quietly, and she wasn't angry, which was worse. You'd rather lose me on purpose than risk losing me by accident, same as that song. You'd rather stop one note short forever than play the last note and find out it's really over. She put the orchestra's letter on the piano. I'm not going to beg you to fight for me, Theo. I've spent 3 years learning that you can't make people want what you're offering. But I'll tell you this, I don't want the safe orchestra. I want the sinking ship. I want you and Elijah in this broke, beautiful dying room. I've wanted it for months. All you had to do was ask me to stay, and you couldn't. So I'm going to go home and think, and you're going to figure out whether you're a man who finishes his songs or a man who stops one note short of his whole life. And she left. And I sat down at the piano, and I did what I've always done, the only thing I know how to do. I played the unfinished song, all the way up to the leaning note, the questioning chord, the place where Nadia stopped, and my hands hovered over the keys. And for 6 years, 2,000 nights, I had taken my hands away right there and kept her in that suspended place. And I heard Grace's voice. It wants to resolve. And I heard my own son from earlier that same week behind the bar. You just have to mean it. I want to tell you I found the courage alone. I didn't. It was Elijah. I had heard the whole fight from the office, my son 9 years old, and he came out and climbed up onto the piano bench next to me, the way he used to climb up next to his mother. And he looked at my hands frozen over the keys, and he said, Dad, play the next note. I don't know if I can, I told him. Honest for once. Mom would want you to, he said. And then my son, who had lost his mother's voice at 3 years old and had been quietly missing it his whole life, said the thing that finished me. I don't really remember what she sounded like anymore, but when Grace plays, I feel the same way I feel in the pictures of when Mom held me, and I don't want that to go away too. I put my hands down, and I played the next note. The answer note, the one Grace had played that first Tuesday, and then the note after that, and the note after that, and for the first time in 6 years, the song kept going past the place where Nadia died out into the part I had never been able to write, and I understood playing it why I'd never been able to finish it. Because I'd been trying to write an ending that undid her death, and there wasn't one, there was never going to be one. The only ending the song could have was one that walked through her death and came out the other side, still singing. That was the note I'd been missing for 6 years. Not a note that pretended she hadn't died, a note that agreed she had and chose to keep playing anyway. I finished the song that night alone at the piano with my son asleep against my side. And in the morning, I drove to the little apartment where Grace was packing, and I did not do anything noble, and I did not talk about sinking ships. I knocked on her door, and when she opened it, I said, Stay, I love you. I finished the song. Don't take the orchestra. Marry me and run a sinking ship with me and teach my son to mean it. Please, I'm asking. I'm finally asking. Grace looked at me for a long moment in the doorway with a half-packed box in her arms. Then she set the box down and she said, You finished it, the whole thing. The whole thing, I said. It resolves. You were right. It always wanted to resolve. I was just too scared to let it. Play it for me, she said. The ending, right now. Hum it, I don't care. If it's real, I'll hear it. I stood in the hallway of a cheap apartment building and I hummed my dead wife's finished song to a living woman. The ending I'd found the night before, and Grace Bellamy closed her eyes and listened the way only she could listen. And when I got to the last note, her eyes were streaming, and she was smiling, and she said, That's it. That's the note. You found it. Yow beautiful, stubborn man, you found it. We did not save the club with love alone. I want to be honest about that because I hate stories that pretend the money works itself out. What actually happened started with a recording. Grace's old conservatory friend, a woman named Priya, who now engineered records for a living, drove 3 hours with a single good microphone and a laptop, because Grace called her at midnight and said, You have to hear what this man finally wrote. We recorded it in the empty blue egret at 2 in the morning chairs up on the tables. Just the one microphone standing between the piano and Grace's chair. Click track, no second take because Priya said the second I heard it, that this was a one-take song, that whatever we'd catch the first time through was the only true version, and everything after would be us performing the truth instead of telling it. So we played it once. The finished song, all the way through, past the leaning note, past the place where Nadia died, out into the ending I'd found with my son asleep against my side. Grace's tremor was there. You can hear it if you know to listen. One note in the last phrase that wavers, and Priya wanted to fix it, and Grace said, "No, leave it." That's the whole point. That's a hand that shouldn't be able to play this at all. Playing it anyway. When the last note faded, none of us moved for a long time. Then Priya took her headphones off, and she was crying, this professional woman who'd recorded famous people in famous rooms, and she said, "That's the realest thing I've ever put on tape." She put it online herself without asking me, because she said some things are too true to sit in a drawer, and I have never once been angry that she did, and people heard it. Not millions, this isn't that kind of story, but enough. Enough that strangers started driving in from out of town to sit at the 40 tables and hear the pianist and the violinist play the finished song live. Enough that the owner's son, watching a line form outside a club he'd written off, offered me a new lease instead of an eviction, because even unsentimental men understand a full room. Enough to keep the doors open. Enough. Grace and I were married on the little stage of the Blue Egret 11 months later on a Monday, when the club was dark, with Elijah standing up as my best man in a suit we bought 2 sizes too big so he could grow into it. There was no first dance. There was a first song instead. Grace played her worn violin, tremor and all, and I played my grandfather's piano, and we played the finished song for a room full of the people who'd kept us alive. And my son sat in the front row and cried the way you cry when something is so good you can't hold it. And I understood that Nadia was in that room, not as a ghost, but as the reason the beginning, the note, the whole song had started from. Sol was there at his 2-top by the window, 1 bourbon no ice, tapping the 2 and the 4 with 2 old fingers, and when we hit the last note, the note that walks through death and keeps singing, the old man stood all the way up on his bad knees, alone before anyone else, and he didn't clap. He just stood with his hand over his heart and let the tears run, and one by one the whole room stood up with him, and nobody clapped for a long moment, because some things you honor with your standing and your silence before you honor them with your hands. Before the vows. Grace had asked me for one thing, and it wasn't a ring. She'd asked me to teach Elijah the ending of the song, so that if anything ever happened to either of us, the finished version would never be lost again. Never stop 1 note short again. So my son knew it too by heart by then, and halfway through on the last chorus, Elijah came up out of the front row without being asked and stood in the curve of the piano, where his mother used to stand, and where he'd learned to stand himself, and he played the simple bass line underneath his father and his new mother, 13 years old, meaning every note, and the 3 of us finished the song together that Nadia had begun, and I thought my chest would not be able to hold what was in it. That is the truest picture I have of my whole life. The 3 of us around 1 piano finishing a song that a 4th person started in a room full of people who almost let it end. The Blue Egret is still open. It does well now, well enough, which for a jazz club is a miracle, and I know it. Grace runs the music and teaches a whole crop of ordinary kids who will never be prodigies and will spend their whole lives meaning it, which she says is the only thing worth teaching. Elijah is 13 now and plays bass. Of all things, decided he didn't want to compete with either of his parents and picked the instrument nobody else in the family plays, which I respect. He still isn't a prodigy. He still means it. That's the whole secret, and my son learned it at 9 behind a bar from a woman who lost her own fireworks and found something better in the slow things. And every night at the end of every set, I still play the song. But I finish it now, all the way to the last note, the note that walks through her death and comes out singing. And I don't take my hands off the keys anymore, and I don't keep her suspended in the place where the answer hasn't come. Because the answer came. The answer walked into my empty club on a dead Tuesday in November with a worn violin and no money and a tremor in her hand. And she played the 1 note I was too afraid to play, and she taught me that finishing the song isn't the same as saying goodbye. It's saying that the song was worth playing all the way to the end. If you made it all the way here, then you already know this was never really a story about a song. It was a story about the note. We stop 1 step short of the last note, the one we're too afraid to play, because playing it means admitting something is over. So before you go, do this for me. If there is a song in your life you've been leaving unfinished, a call you haven't made, a note you haven't played because you're scared of what comes after it, put one word in the comments, just one. The word for the thing you've been stopping short of. You don't have to explain it, just let it exist. And if this story reached you, subscribe and stay with me because I've got more of them. True ones, hard ones, stories about the last note and the people brave enough to play it for us when we can't. The next one starts the way all the good ones do, with somebody sitting alone in an empty room, one note short of home. Because that, it turns out, is almost always the exact moment before the right person walks through the door and plays the rest.